The low rumble of the vintage motorcycle echoed through the deserted highway, cutting through the cool evening air. James Williams leaned forward, savoring the hum of the engine and the rush of wind against his face. He was the police chief of Oak Ridge, a small city just outside the metro. And while he carried the respect of his position and the weight of his responsibilities every day, tonight was different. Tonight was about freedom. Riding his father's vintage bike had become his ritual after grueling days at the precinct. It was an escape that offered solace and reminded him of who he was beneath the badge and title. The motorcycle was more than just a bike. It was a piece of his father's legacy, a man who had taught him the value of resilience and integrity. James had restored the bike himself, working on it for years, adding each bolt with care. He could still hear his father's steady voice, imparting lessons during their weekend rides. "You don't ever let anyone take away your pride, son. Stand tall, always." The faint scent of pine mingled with the earth, and he allowed himself a deep breath. These quiet nights were a gift, a reprieve from the challenges he faced as the city's first black police chief. The road ahead, winding and bathed in the golden light of dusk, was his reminder of freedom and peace, but that peace was shattered in an instant. Red and blue lights flashed behind him, cutting through the tranquil evening. James tensed as a patrol car pulled up, sirens wailing. Confused, he glanced at his speedometer. He wasn't speeding, hadn't broken any laws. There was no reason for tea. The patrol car pulled up close, almost nudging his bike as it signaled him to stop. James's heart raced, but he forced himself to remain calm. With a controlled breath, he slowed down and pulled over to the shoulder, feeling the familiar tension in his muscles as he prepared for whatever was about to happen. He turned off the engine and removed his helmet, placing it on the seat. His mind ran through all the scenarios as he watched the two officers emerge from the patrol car, their hands resting on their gun belts, their faces etched. "Evening, officers," James greeted, keeping his voice calm but firm. The older officer, tall with a square jaw and close-cropped hair, stepped forward with an expression that was less than friendly. His younger partner hung back. "License and registration." The older officer barked. James complied, moving slowly as he retrieved his documents, hoping to de-escalate the situation before it could spiral. He handed over his ID and watched the older officer's face twist into a frown as he examined it. "This your bike?" the officer asked, a note of disbelief lacing his tone. "Yes," James replied. "I restored it myself." The officer snorted, his eyes sweeping over the vintage motorcycle with barely concealed disdain. "Doesn't look like something you'd own," he said, his voice heavy with implication. James felt a familiar sting of frustration but kept his composure. "Is there a problem, officer?" The younger one looked over the ID, raising an eyebrow. Chief James Williams." His tone softened with recognition. "Chief of police?" The older officer's eyes narrowed, a smirk playing on his lips. "Chief of police. Ha!" he sneered. "You don't look like any chief I've ever seen." James exhaled slowly, biting back a response. "That's because I left my uniform at the station," he said, his voice even. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, glancing between his partner and James. "Maybe we should call dispatch and verify." But the older officer was unmoved. He waved off his partner's suggestion and took a step closer to James. "What kind of chief rides around on a beat-up old bike like this? This doesn't look right to me." James fought to keep his temper in check, knowing that any sign of anger could escalate the situation. "If you're concerned, feel free to run the plates," he suggested, his tone remaining calm. The older officer ignored him, his eyes narrowing further. "We've had reports of stolen bikes in the area. Yours fits the description." James knew exactly what was happening. This wasn't about procedure, it was about power. The kind that came from wielding authority over someone they assumed was powerless. "Officers, I understand you're just doing your job," he said, attempting to de-escalate. "But if you contact dispatch, They'll confirm who I am." The older officer gave a harsh laugh. Ignoring James's request, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a lighter. "You sure this isn't stolen?" "Chief." James's heart skipped a beat as he watched the officer move the lighter dangerously close to the fuel line. "Don't," James said, his voice low and controlled. His eyes locked on the flame. The older officer's smirk widened, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "What's the matter, Chief? Afraid to lose something valuable?" James felt his chest tighten. Every memory attached to the bike, every moment he'd spent restoring it, every ride he'd taken with his father, came rushing back in an overwhelming tide. This wasn't just a bike. It was a piece of his father, a part of his heritage. But any reaction would only give them the excuse they wanted. He held his breath, forcing himself to stay calm, to hold his ground as the officer brought the flame closer. And then, with a cold smile, the officer touched the flame to the fuel line. The bike erupted in flames. James's stomach dropped as he watched the flames lick along the metal and leather, devouring everything in seconds. His memories, his heritage, all reduced to a pile of smoldering ash. He wanted to scream, to lash out, but he knew that any reaction would only make things worse. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, his eyes flicking between James and the burning motorcycle. "Maybe we should go," he muttered, visibly shaken. The older officer shrugged, snapping the lighter shut. "Guess it wasn't worth much after all," he sneered before turning back to the patrol car. James stood frozen, his fists clenched at his sides as he watched them drive away, leaving him alone in the darkness with nothing but the smoldering remains of his bike. He closed his eyes, letting the loss wash over him, the memories, the legacy, everything his father had passed down to him. When he opened his eyes, all that remained was a pile of charred metal. But there, standing amidst the ashes, a new resolve took root within him, a fierce determination that blazed hotter than the flames. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The flames of his father's motorcycle were still fresh in James's mind as he walked through the front doors of Oak Ridge Police Station. His stride was purposeful, and his expression was harder than usual. The hum of activity in the station fell silent, heads turning to look at him with curiosity and concern. But the silent respect he'd earned over his years as chief was now accompanied by something else, a tension born of the terrible story that was about to unfold. Lieutenant Smith, James's trusted second-in-command, was the first to approach him. Smith's brow furrowed as he took in James's somber expression. "Chief, are you all right?" Smith asked, his voice low, though his eyes betrayed a sense of worry. "What happened?" James met his gaze and spoke calmly, but his words carried a heavy weight. "Two of our own stopped me on my ride home tonight, Officers Miller and Jacobs. They destroyed my motorcycle, my father's bike, right in front of me." Smith's eyes widened with disbelief, and a few officers nearby, hearing his words, looked stunned. They'd heard rumors of Officer Miller's questionable conduct, but even so, this was unthinkable. "Destroyed?" Smith asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes." James's jaw tightened as he glanced around the room, taking in the faces of the officers who were now listening. It was a deliberate act, an abuse of power meant to humiliate and intimidate. The tension in the room thickened, and James could see the mix of anger and discomfort on the faces of his team. There were officers here who believed in the work, who upheld their oath with honor, and he could tell they were as appalled as he was. "Lieutenant Smith," James said, his tone turning businesslike, "I need you to initiate a formal investigation. Interview both officers. Get statements from anyone who was on patrol or in contact with them tonight. I want this handled by the book, and I want it thorough." Smith nodded. "Yes, sir. I'll get started right away." He paused, looking at James with quiet resolve. "We'll make this right, Chief." James felt a flicker of gratitude for Smith's support. He knew Smith well, trusted him as much as anyone in the department. But this was bigger than a few loyal colleagues. It was a battle against a culture that had allowed officers like Miller to believe they could act without consequence. Hours later, James and Smith met in his office. Smith had gathered preliminary details, though the full investigation would take days. He'd managed to locate Miller and Jacobs, who were holed up in a motel just outside city limits, lying low, likely thinking they could avoid consequences until the situation blew over. "They're not taking this seriously, Chief," Smith said, a frustrated edge in his voice. "Miller's been grinning through every answer, acting like this is a minor inconvenience." James's eyes darkened, but he remained composed. "And Jacobs?" Smith sighed. "He's a different story. Nervous. Looks like he wants to talk but doesn't have the backbone to speak up against Miller." James leaned back, his fingers tapping the desk in thought. "Miller's been a problem for a while, hasn't he? I've seen complaints, heard rumors." Smith nodded. "He has, but nothing that's stuck. Every complaint that's been brought against him was either quietly dismissed or labeled as unsubstantiated." "Unsubstantiated," James echoed, a bitter taste on his tongue. The word was a familiar one in cases of police misconduct, often used to bury accusations that no one wanted to investigate. "That ends now." Smith's eyes held a glint of determination. "What's our next move?" James straightened. "We're going to bring Miller and Jacobs in. I want this investigation to proceed with transparency. If we want the public to trust us, they need to see that we're capable of holding our own accountable." James and Smith led a team to the motel where Miller and Jacobs were hiding. When they arrived, the sun had barely risen, casting a muted glow over the parking lot as they approached the room. James gave a sharp knock on the door, his voice carrying authority. "Officers Miller and Jacobs, this is Chief Williams. Open up." The door opened slowly, and Officer Jacobs appeared, looking disheveled and uneasy. His eyes darted around, settling on James before quickly glancing away. Behind him, Miller leaned against the wall with a smirk, arms crossed, exuding smug confidence. "Chief Williams," Miller drawled, his tone dripping with mockery. "Come to thank us for the roadside assistance last night?" James kept his expression neutral, though his gaze held an edge. "Officers Miller and Jacobs, you're coming with us. You're under investigation for misconduct, destruction of property, and abuse of authority." Miller scoffed, crossing his arms with a smirk. "Oh, is that so? You really think anyone's going to take your word over ours?" James held his gaze, unyielding. "Yes, I do." Jacobs shifted uncomfortably, casting a nervous glance at Miller before looking back at James. "Chief, I was just following orders." "Following orders?" James's tone hardened. "You had a choice, Jacobs. Standing by while a crime is committed makes you just as guilty." Jacobs looked down, his shoulders slumping as the weight of his actions seemed to finally register. But Miller's defiance only grew, his sneer deepening as he laughed. "You really think anyone cares about your bike, Chief? Just a piece of junk. Like you." James's expression didn't falter. He'd faced men like Miller before, men who believed they were untouchable, who thrived on intimidation. "This isn't just about a bike, Miller. It's about your abuse of power, and it ends now." With that, he nodded to Smith, who stepped forward and placed handcuffs on Miller and Jacobs. Miller didn't resist, though his smirk never wavered. As they were led out to the waiting patrol cars, Miller muttered under his breath, "You'll regret this, Chief. You don't know who you're messing with." James watched them go, his heart heavy but his resolve unshaken. This wasn't just about those two officers. It was about rooting out a culture of corruption, about changing the standards that allowed officers to act with impunity. Once back at the station, James gathered the officers in the briefing room, ready to address his team about the situation. The tension in the room was palpable, with officers shifting in their seats, exchanging uncertain glances. They knew this was serious. Miller and Jacobs weren't just any officers. They represented a faction within the force that had become all too comfortable with bending the rules. James stood at the front of the room, his gaze steady as he scanned the faces before him. "I won't sugarcoat this," he began. "What happened last night wasn't just a matter of misconduct. It was a blatant abuse of power that goes against everything we stand for." His voice was clear, steady, carrying the weight of both his authority and his conviction. "For too long, we've allowed behavior like Miller's to go unpunished, dismissing it as unsubstantiated or minor infractions. But that ends today." He paused, meeting the eyes of each officer in the room. "The public trusts us to protect and serve. They look to us for justice. And if we can't hold ourselves accountable, we have no right to expect their trust. I took an oath, just like each of you did, and I intend to honor it." There was a murmur of agreement from the room, and James felt a swell of pride as he saw the determination in the faces around him. He knew that not everyone in the department shared Miller's views, and he intended to empower those who believed in true justice. Over the following weeks, James initiated a series of reforms within the department. Training sessions on accountability, ethics, and racial sensitivity became mandatory, and an independent oversight committee was established to handle complaints against officers. Miller and Jacobs were placed on suspension pending the results of the investigation, and their actions served as a catalyst for change. The case gained media attention, with the community rallying behind James's commitment to transparency and justice. Public support poured in, with many residents expressing gratitude for his courage and determination. They, too, had seen the cracks in the system, and they recognized the rarity of a leader willing to confront them head-on. One day, James received a call from Officer Hernandez, a seasoned cop who'd kept his head down for most of his career. Hernandez requested a private meeting, and when he arrived, James saw a shift in the usually reserved officer's demeanor. "Chief," Hernandez began, his voice low, "I've seen things that, well, things that aren't right. I'm not proud to say that I didn't speak up before, but after what you did, I want to help. I want to make things better around here." James felt a surge of respect for Hernandez, who had come forward despite the potential backlash. They discussed past incidents, and Hernandez provided valuable insights that helped to expose patterns of misconduct. With the support of officers like Hernandez, James's reform efforts gained momentum, creating a ripple effect within the department. The cases of misconduct were addressed, and the entire department began to see the shift from within. As weeks turned into months, the Oak Ridge Police Department began to transform. The community's faith in the department was slowly being rebuilt, and James knew the road ahead would still be long and challenging. But he was prepared to see it through. The memory of his father's motorcycle, burned but not forgotten, became a symbol. This wasn't the end of the battle. It was the beginning of a new era, one built on integrity, accountability, and a commitment to the people they served. And James would stand at the forefront, leading his department with the strength his father had taught him, refusing to let injustice go unchallenged. The department buzzed with a tense energy in the days following the arrests of Miller and Jacobs. Rumors swirled as officers whispered in hallways, shared sideways glances, and kept their heads down in the presence of Chief Williams. Some were wary, others relieved, and a few simply held their breath, waiting to see where this investigation would lead. James had just left a meeting with the Oversight Committee, who had already begun their audit of misconduct complaints within the department. The results so far were both sobering and infuriating. Incidents buried, complaints dismissed as unsubstantiated, and patterns of abuse that stretched far beyond Miller and Jacobs. The culture he had inherited wasn't merely damaged, it was rotting from within. Lieutenant Smith entered James's office as he reviewed a pile of case files. "Chief," Smith said, his voice low, "we're getting more from the Oversight Committee. It's not good. We're seeing issues going back years." James set down the file he'd been reviewing, his eyes steely. "How far back?" 5, maybe 6 years." Smith replied. I'm seeing the names of some of our most senior officers on these cases. Complaints swept under the rug. Reports altered. It's bigger than we thought. James nodded, though he wasn't surprised. He'd always suspected that Miller wasn't alone, that others had either directly supported him or at least turned a blind eye. But seeing it on paper brought a fresh wave of anger and urgency. They weren't just investigating individuals. They were about to dismantle an entire culture of silence. 2 days later, Hernandez, the seasoned officer who had first approached James, returned to his office with a file in hand. "Chief, I've got something you need to see," Hernandez said, his face grim. James gestured for him to sit as he took the file. "What did you find?" Hernandez shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I was going through past cases like you asked. There's one incident that, well, is bad. A few years ago, an innocent man was arrested and injured while in custody. There was a lot of pressure on the officers involved to make it go away. And it did. No one was ever held accountable." James's stomach dropped. Was Miller involved? Hernandez hesitated. Yes, and he wasn't alone. There were other senior officers who signed off on it. They made sure it never went up the chain. James clenched his jaw. It wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a systemic cover-up. This went beyond misconduct. It was a coordinated effort to protect their own, no matter the cost. "We need to reopen this case," James said firmly, "and any others like it. People need to know that the system is working for them, not against them." Hernandez nodded, relief crossing his face. "I'll help in any way I can, Chief." James soon found himself in the thick of a full-scale investigation. The Oversight Committee dug deeper, uncovering more cases of neglect, racial profiling, and abuse. And as the reports surfaced, something unexpected happened. Other officers began coming forward, providing information on incidents they had witnessed but were too afraid to report. Word spread quickly. James received messages of support from community leaders and even civilians who had interacted with him during his years on the force. But for every message of support, there was an undercurrent of resistance within the department. The old guard, officers who had been with the department for decades, grew more defensive, their hostility brewing as James continued his push for transparency. One afternoon, as he made his way through the halls, James overheard 2 officers muttering under their breath as he passed. "This department's gone soft." One of them sneered. "Back in the day, we didn't need to cater to civilians who cry foul every time they don't get their way." James stopped, his jaw clenched, but he said nothing. He knew better than to engage in petty arguments. His silence, his commitment to action over words, would speak louder than any retort. As the investigation progressed, Officer Jacobs grew more visibly anxious. He was brought in for questioning multiple times, each session peeling back another layer of truth. He had avoided direct confrontation, but after several interviews, it became clear he was ready to talk. In the small, dimly lit interrogation room, James sat across from Jacobs, observing the officer's jittery posture and darting eyes. Jacobs looked down, wringing his hands, visibly uncomfortable. "Officer Jacobs," James began, his tone calm but firm. "I need the truth, not just about what happened that night, but about anything else you may have seen. You know what this investigation means. You know what's at stake." Jacobs hesitated, his face pale. "I didn't want any part of it," he stammered. "Miller, he's persuasive. He said no one would care, that you didn't deserve the respect of a real chief. He's been pushing that idea for years." James's eyes narrowed, but he let Jacobs continue, watching the nervous officer grapple with his words. "Miller has been, well, he's been doing this a long time, getting away with things. I was just trying to fit in. He said it's how things work here, that if you push back, they'll push you out." James's voice was steady. "And is that why you kept quiet?" Jacobs looked down, guilt etched on his face. "Yes, I'm not proud of it, Chief, but everyone knew what he was doing, and no one ever stopped him." James absorbed his words, each revelation adding to the growing puzzle of dysfunction within his department. Jacobs wasn't innocent, but he was also a product of the toxic environment that had festered unchecked. Jacobs, James said, leaning forward, I can't change the past, but I can give you an opportunity to make things right. This is your chance to speak up, to help rebuild this department into something you can be proud of. Jacobs nodded slowly, relief and shame mingling in his expression. I'll testify, he said quietly. I'll tell you everything. Word of the investigation spread beyond Oak Ridge. Public hearing was called, with community members, city officials, and media invited to observe. James stood at the center of it all, prepared to answer questions, to share the investigation's findings, and to confront the rot within his own department. The hearing room buzzed with anticipation as James took his place at the podium, facing a panel of city officials and a packed audience. Community leaders, reporters, and residents had gathered, their expressions expectant and wary. Councilwoman Green, a longtime advocate for police reform, began the questioning. Chief Williams, thank you for being here. I think I speak for many in this room when I say that what you're doing is unprecedented. Could you tell us what led to this investigation? James took a steadying breath, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge of determination. This investigation began after two of my own officers, Officers Miller and Jacobs, abused their authority and targeted me in an incident. What followed was a revelation of systemic issues that have been neglected for far too long. He looked out at the audience, his gaze meeting those of his fellow officers, the community members, and local officials who had supported his efforts. I made a promise to myself and to my father, who taught me the value of integrity, that I would never stand by and allow injustice to prevail. This department serves the people, and we have a duty to hold ourselves to the highest standard. Councilwoman Green nodded. Chief Williams, what are your plans moving forward to ensure that this culture of abuse and silence doesn't continue? James met her gaze. We're implementing mandatory training on racial bias and ethics. The Oversight Committee will review all cases of misconduct, past and present. Any officer found to have abused their authority will face consequences. This department's mission is to protect and serve, and if we can't do that with integrity, we don't deserve the public's trust. The audience erupted into applause, the energy in the room shifting from skepticism to support. James felt a swell of pride as he saw his vision of a just and transparent department begin to take root. Following the hearing, James returned to the department, where a few officers greeted him with a newfound respect. Some had been skeptical, even resistant, but they could see that James wasn't backing down. He wasn't just talking about change, he was living it, and it was inspiring those who had long felt disillusioned. Over the next few weeks, more officers stepped forward, sharing stories of misconduct they had witnessed or been pressured to ignore. They were finally free to speak up, unburdening themselves from years of complicity, and James welcomed each story as a stepping stone toward a better department. But there were still pockets of resistance, officers who had enjoyed the privilege of operating without accountability. They saw James's reforms as a threat, and the resentment lingered like a shadow. James knew this battle wasn't over, that transforming the department would require sustained effort and an unwavering commitment to justice. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, James found himself in the station's garage, staring at the empty spot where his father's bike had once been parked. The memory of the flames that had consumed it haunted him, a reminder of what he had lost. But that same memory was also the source of his strength, a symbol of the legacy he was determined to honor. He closed his eyes, letting the memories wash over him. His father's laughter, their weekend rides, the lessons he'd absorbed along the way. His father had taught him to face challenges head-on, to stand for what was right, no matter the cost. When he opened his eyes, his resolve had only strengthened. The road ahead would be long, but he was ready to face it. As he turned to leave, He spotted Smith watching from the doorway. "Chief," Smith said, his voice filled with admiration. "I just wanted to say, thank you. You've given us something to believe in." James nodded, the weight of the past few weeks settling over him. "Thank you, Smith. But this is just the beginning. We have a lot more work to do." Smith nodded. "And we're with you, all the way." James gave him a small but genuine smile. He knew he wasn't alone, and with the support of those who believed in justice, he would continue this fight, determined to create a department that honored the values his father had instilled in him. Word of Chief James Williams's investigation into the Oak Ridge Police Department spread rapidly, reaching every corner of the city. News outlets ran headlines praising his courage, while social media was ablaze with both support and resistance. Community leaders called for a rally to show solidarity with the chief's efforts, urging people to come forward with their stories of police interactions. The outpouring of support was overwhelming. Residents who had once hesitated to trust law enforcement were now standing in support of James's vision for a transparent and accountable police department. But alongside the support came resistance from certain circles, especially from officers and officials who saw his actions as a threat to their authority. As the rally date approached, James felt the weight of the expectations on his shoulders. This was no longer just about him, it was about the entire community, about giving people a voice in the fight against injustice. And for every person who stood by him, he knew there were others who were waiting, hoping for him to stumble. The day of the rally arrived bright and clear, with a cloudless sky stretching above Oak Ridge's main square. Banners waved in the gentle breeze, and signs carried messages like, "Justice for all," "Trust through transparency," and "We stand with Chief Williams." Hundreds gathered, filling the square with a vibrant energy as people of all ages and backgrounds united for a common cause. James watched from the sidelines, momentarily overwhelmed by the crowd's sheer size. This was more than he had anticipated, and the sight of so many faces, young and old, black, white, and every background in between, gave him a renewed sense of purpose. Councilwoman Green, who had chaired the recent public hearing, approached James, a warm smile on her face. "Chief Williams, the community is behind you. They believe in what you're doing, and they're here to make sure you know that." James nodded, feeling a mix of pride and humility. "It's incredible, but I couldn't have done this alone. The support from everyone, from you, from the council, from the people here, it means everything." She placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're doing something many people only dream about. You're changing the system from within, and you've inspired an entire city in the process." He looked out at the crowd, feeling the weight of her words. Councilwoman Green stepped up to the podium and greeted the crowd with a firm voice, commanding attention as she opened the rally with a few words of support. "Today, we stand together," she said, her voice strong and clear, "in support of a chief who has taken a stand for justice, for transparency, and for a safer, fairer Oak Ridge. Chief Williams is working to ensure that every resident feels protected and respected. His mission isn't just about law enforcement, it's about community, trust, and integrity." The crowd cheered, and Green gestured for James to come to the microphone. As he took her place, the applause swelled, filling the square with a thunderous sound. James held up a hand, signaling for quiet, and the noise slowly faded. He looked out at the crowd, pausing before he spoke, letting the gravity of the moment sink in. "I want to thank every single one of you for being here today," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I've served as your police chief because I believe in this community. I believe in the power of justice, in the importance of holding ourselves to a higher standard. But too often, those values have been overshadowed by a culture that tolerates abuse, that rewards silence." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. "I stand here," he continued, "not just as your chief, but as someone who believes that every single person in this city deserves to be treated with respect and dignity. I grew up learning the value of integrity from my father, a man who taught me that no one, not even those in power, is above accountability. Applause broke out again, punctuated by shouts of support from the crowd. This movement, he said, gesturing to the people around him, isn't just about me. It's about all of us. It's about every voice that's been silenced, every injustice that's been ignored. Together, we can build a police department that serves and protects with honor. The crowd roared with approval, and as James stepped back, the applause continued, a powerful reminder of the city's readiness for change. Despite the rally's success, the aftermath brought challenges James had anticipated but hoped to avoid. A vocal group within the department, the Old Guard, saw his reforms as an attack on their authority. Some grumbled that his actions were undermining morale. Others whispered that he was a disruption to the way things had always been done. They circulated rumors, questioning his motives, painting his reforms as radical and unnecessary. Captain Roy Sanders, a veteran officer with decades on the force, had been particularly vocal in his criticism. He was a respected figure in the department, known for his strict adherence to tradition, and, like many of his peers, he had deep reservations about the direction James was taking. One afternoon, Sanders confronted James in the hallway, his face tense with barely contained anger. "Chief Williams," Sanders began, his voice low and cutting, "I have to tell you, there are quite a few of us who don't appreciate the way you're handling things. We've served this city for years, and now it feels like you're undermining everything we've built." James met his gaze, refusing to be intimidated. "Captain Sanders, this department is meant to serve and protect everyone in this community, not just uphold traditions that cover up misconduct." "Misconduct?" Sanders spat the word. "We're police officers. We do what we have to do to keep people safe. Sometimes that means making tough calls. Tough calls don't mean burning someone's property out of spite or targeting someone because of the color of their skin." James replied, his tone firm but calm. "That isn't protecting. It's abuse, and it has no place here." Sanders' eyes narrowed. "You don't understand. Williams, you're new here. You don't know how things work." James took a step closer, his voice low but resolute. "I know exactly how things work, Sanders, and I know what needs to change. If you can't get on board with that, then perhaps you need to reconsider whether you belong here." Sanders' face hardened, and he turned on his heel, leaving without another word. James knew this wasn't the end of the opposition, but he was prepared. He would not let fear or resistance deter him. Meanwhile, support from the community continued to pour in. Local business owners displayed signs in their windows that read, "We stand with Chief Williams." Churches held gatherings to pray for the department's reform efforts, and residents came forward with their own stories of both positive and negative interactions with the police, helping to create a clearer picture of where the department was succeeding and where it had failed. One evening, as James was leaving the station, he was stopped by a young man who had been part of the rally. He looked nervous, glancing around before he spoke. "Chief Williams," he began, his voice quiet, I just wanted to thank you. I grew up here, and I've seen things that made me lose faith in the system. But what you're doing, it gives me hope." James smiled, touched by the sincerity in the young man's voice. "Thank you. That means a lot. We still have a long way to go, but I won't stop fighting for change." The young man nodded, his eyes filled with respect. "You're making a difference, Chief. Don't let them make you stop." As the man walked away, James felt a renewed sense of purpose. These were the people he served, the people who deserved a department they could trust. As the internal investigation pressed on, disturbing patterns continued to emerge. Smith, his loyal lieutenant, provided daily updates on the progress, though each one seemed to bring more evidence of how deep the corruption ran. Officers who had been untouchable for years were now facing disciplinary action, and for some, outright dismissal was on the horizon. Smith stopped by his office one evening, a folder in hand. "Chief, I think you'll want to see this." He opened the file to reveal a series of statements from officers who had recently come forward, detailing incidents of misconduct that implicated not just Miller and Jacobs but others high up in the chain of command. James read through the statements, his face grim. "So it's worse than we thought." Smith nodded. "Yes, but it's all coming to light now. Thanks to you. They wouldn't have spoken up if you hadn't set the example." James nodded, though the weight of the revelations pressed down on him. "This won't be easy, Smith. Some people are going to fight us every step of the way." Smith gave a small, determined smile. "Then we'll keep fighting back. You're not alone in this, Chief. We're with you." As the investigation neared its conclusion, the City Council announced that they would be implementing James's proposed reforms on a permanent basis, ensuring that future leaders of the department would be held to the same standards. It was a victory hard won, but it was only the beginning. The old guard continued to resist, but their influence was waning. The department was evolving, and the community's faith in law enforcement was slowly being rebuilt. One evening, as James locked up his office, he took a moment to look out over the city he had sworn to protect. He could still see the empty spot where his father's motorcycle had once been parked, and he felt a pang of loss. But he knew his father would be proud, not just of his title, but of his determination to create a department that would serve the people with honor. This wasn't the end of his journey. It was just the beginning of a movement that would change Oak Ridge forever. And with his team and community behind him, James knew he had the strength to keep moving forward, to continue the fight for justice, no matter the challenges that lay ahead. The Oak Ridge Police Department felt like a different place in the weeks following the rally and the implementation of James's reforms. The air was tense but charged with a new sense of purpose. Training sessions on bias, ethics, and accountability were mandatory, and an independent oversight committee now reviewed all complaints and disciplinary actions. Officers were required to undergo de-escalation training and to attend community meetings, where they had to face residents directly and listen to their concerns. But not everyone was happy with the changes. Within the department, the division between those who supported the new policies and those who resented them became more pronounced. The old guard, led by Captain Sanders and a handful of senior officers, saw James's actions as a threat to their way of life. They whispered in hallways, questioning his motives, claiming he was tearing down the department's traditions. The pushback was relentless, and though James stood firm, he felt the strain of leading a divided team. He knew that real change took time, that resistance was inevitable, but there were days when the weight of it all felt overwhelming. As the changes continued, James began receiving visits from influential figures in the city, local business leaders, longtime residents, and even city council members who had once supported him now questioned his approach, arguing that the new policies were too radical and would create distrust within the ranks. One afternoon, James was summoned to a meeting with Mayor Dixon, a seasoned politician who had supported him since his appointment as chief. But as he walked into the mayor's office, James could sense that this conversation would be different. The mayor greeted him with a forced smile, gesturing for him to sit. "James, thanks for coming in. I wanted to discuss the recent changes in the department." James sat down, meeting the mayor's gaze. "Of course, I'm happy to answer any questions." Mayor Dixon leaned back, his fingers drumming on the table. "There's no doubt you've done a remarkable job implementing these reforms, but I'm hearing concerns. Some of our donors and local leaders feel that the changes might be too much, too fast. They're worried about the impact on officer morale and, frankly, on our city's image." James took a breath, steadying himself. "Mayor, I understand their concerns. Change is difficult, and it can create discomfort. But these reforms are necessary. The department's culture needed an overhaul if we want the community to trust us." The mayor nodded but pressed on. "James, we want the same thing, but you have to understand that this resistance isn't just from within the department. It's becoming political. We're under pressure from powerful people, and some are saying that your approach is dividing the city." James clenched his jaw, choosing his words carefully. With respect, sir, these changes are building a stronger, more accountable department. The resistance isn't coming from the community. It's from those who don't want to be held accountable. Mayor Dixon sighed, leaning forward. Look, James, I'm not saying stop, but ease up a bit. Let things settle before pushing forward. We need stability as much as we need reform. James stood up, nodding firmly. Stability is important,
Mayor.
but without accountability, stability is just complacency. I appreciate your advice, but I can't let up now. We've come too far to turn back. The mayor's expression hardened, but he nodded. All right, Chief, just remember, politics has a way of complicating things. Tread carefully. The conversation with the mayor left James feeling more determined but also increasingly isolated. As he walked back to the station, he thought of his father and the lessons he'd taught him. Integrity wasn't something you could compromise, it was something you had to defend, no matter the cost. But later that evening, an unexpected confrontation shook him. Officer Hernandez, who had been one of James's most vocal supporters, approached him, visibly troubled. Chief, can we talk? Hernandez asked, his expression uncharacteristically tense. James gestured to his office. Of course, come in. Hernandez sat down, avoiding eye contact as he gathered his thoughts. Chief, I've been struggling with all of this. I've backed you from the beginning because I believe in what you're doing. But some of the guys, they think you're going too far. They're saying you're creating distrust between us and the community, that you're making us look weak. James's heart sank, but he kept his expression calm. And what do you think? Hernandez. Hernandez took a shaky breath, finally meeting James's gaze. I think you're right, but it's hard. We're being told to undo everything we've been taught. It's uncomfortable. And honestly, some of us are scared. James leaned forward, his tone gentle. Hernandez, I understand. Change is scary. But if we don't address these issues, we'll never have the community's trust. We can't protect them if they don't believe in us. Hernandez nodded slowly, visibly torn. I know, but the pressure from the guys, it's intense. I'm starting to wonder if I can keep doing this. James sighed, feeling a pang of disappointment, but he understood. I won't force anyone to stay, Hernandez, but remember, you're part of something bigger here. This isn't just about one chief or one department. It's about creating a legacy of justice. And if we can do that, it'll be worth every sacrifice. Hernandez looked down, his face conflicted. I'll think about it, Chief. I just needed to be honest with you. James nodded, offering a small smile. I appreciate that. Whatever you decide, I respect it. As Hernandez left, James felt the weight of his words settle over him. He knew he couldn't please everyone, couldn't hold on to every officer, but the vision of a department built on integrity was worth the cost, even if it meant standing alone. In the face of growing resistance, James knew he needed allies beyond the department. He reached out to community leaders, organizing meetings with local activists, clergy members, and residents who had been affected by past abuses. He wanted their input, their stories, their hopes for a department they could trust. One evening, he met with Reverend Samuel Ellis, a respected leader known for his activism and dedication to social justice. Chief Williams, Reverend Ellis greeted him warmly. It's an honor to finally meet you. I've been following what you're doing, and I have to say, I'm impressed. You're taking on a system most people would be too afraid to touch. James shook his hand, feeling a deep sense of respect for the Reverend. Thank you, Reverend. It's an honor to have your support. I need voices like yours, people the community trusts, to help us through this transition. The Reverend nodded, his face serious. I'll do what I can, Chief, but I hope you understand. There are a lot of people who've been hurt by this department. It'll take more than policies and speeches to earn their trust back. James met his gaze, his voice steady. I know. That's why I want to hear from them. I want their stories to guide our actions, to remind us of what's at stake." Reverend Ellis's face softened. "Then you have my support, Chief, and the support of my congregation. We'll stand with you." The alliance with Reverend Ellis and other community leaders became a pillar of strength. Helping James push through the resistance, they organized public forums, inviting residents to share their stories and experiences, both good and bad. Officers attended, listening as people spoke about years of distrust, about incidents they had tried to report, only to be dismissed or ignored. It was painful but necessary, a reckoning that reminded the department of its duty to the people it served. One evening, as James returned home, he found an envelope slipped under his door. He picked it up, frowning as he examined the plain white paper. Inside was a typed note that read, "Stay in your lane, Chief. Some of us don't appreciate the changes. Keep this up, and you might regret it." James's hands tightened around the paper, anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. It was a warning, meant to intimidate, to make him doubt his path. But if anything, it only fueled his determination, the culture of fear, the silence that had allowed misconduct to thrive. It was this very mindset he was fighting to dismantle. The note was a reminder of how deeply rooted these issues were, but he refused to let it shake him. James kept the note, using it as a symbol of his commitment. He was aware of the danger, aware that standing up to a broken system had its risks. But he would not back down. The changes continued, despite the resistance, despite the pressure, and despite the threats. Officers like Hernandez decided to stay, choosing to embrace the new vision for the department. Others left, unwilling to adapt. New recruits joined, eager to be part of a department that valued integrity. The road was difficult, filled with setbacks and moments of doubt. But James stayed the course, leaning on allies like Reverend Ellis, Councilwoman Green, and the community members who had placed their trust in him. One evening, as he walked through the station, he caught sight of Hernandez speaking to a group of newer officers. They were listening intently as he shared stories of the past, of the mistakes and the progress the department had made under James's leadership. It was a quiet but powerful moment, a sign that the culture was changing, that the legacy James hoped to build was taking root. As the months passed, the Oak Ridge Police Department transformed, becoming a symbol of what was possible when leadership prioritized justice over tradition, integrity over complacency. There were still battles ahead, still resistance to overcome, but James felt a sense of accomplishment and hope. One evening, he returned to his office and sat quietly, reflecting on everything they had achieved. The burnt memory of his father's motorcycle was still painful, a reminder of the night that had started this journey. But now it symbolized more than loss. It was a beacon of resilience, a testament to his commitment to build something better. He picked up the photo of his father on his desk, looking into the familiar eyes that had taught him so much. "We did it, Dad," he whispered, his voice filled with emotion. "We're building something that'll last." James knew there would always be challenges, but with the strength of his father's lessons and the support of a community united for change, he was ready to face whatever came next. Months had passed since Chief James Williams had launched his reforms in the Oak Ridge Police Department, and the progress was undeniable. The community's faith in the department was being rebuilt, one interaction at a time. New policies were taking root, and even the most skeptical officers had begun to see the benefits of a more accountable, community-oriented approach. But with every step forward, there remained individuals who resisted, clinging to old habits and resentments. A new challenge soon presented itself, a call that would put everything James had built to the test. One late summer afternoon, a call came in about a hostage situation at a small bank on the edge of the city. The suspect was reportedly armed and holding several employees and customers inside. Within minutes, the scene was surrounded by Oak Ridge officers, their patrol cars blocking the streets, creating a barricade. James arrived shortly after, stepping out of his car to assess the situation. Lieutenant Smith was already there, his face tense. "Chief, we've got a gunman inside. He's demanding a getaway car and safe passage, or he's threatening to start shooting hostages." James's mind worked quickly. This was a high-stakes situation, the kind he had trained for, but rarely encountered. He needed to ensure that the safety of the hostages took priority, and that his officers handled the crisis with precision. "Do we have a negotiator on scene?" James asked, scanning the gathered officers. "Officer Hernandez is on his way," Smith replied, his voice steady. "We've been buying time, but he's getting agitated. We need to de-escalate fast." James nodded, glancing at the bank building. "All right, keep everyone focused. We're going to do this by the book. No unnecessary risks." As Hernandez arrived and began negotiating with the suspect, James monitored every detail. The suspect's demands grew more erratic, and his patience waned with each passing minute. James knew that if they failed to establish trust with the suspect, the situation could turn violent. Inside the bank, Hernandez's voice echoed through a megaphone, calm and measured as he addressed the suspect. "We're here to help, all right? Nobody wants anyone hurt today. Tell us what you need, and we'll work with you." But before Hernandez could make any progress, another officer, who had been watching from behind the cars, muttered, "This guy isn't going to listen. We need to go in, take him down, and get it over with." James turned, recognizing the voice. It was Officer Carrington, one of the older officers who had been vocal in his disdain for James's reforms. "Carrington," James said, keeping his tone controlled, "we're handling this carefully. We need to de-escalate, not force a confrontation." Carrington scoffed, his eyes narrowed. "With respect, Chief, I've been doing this job for 20 years. Sometimes you need to show strength to get the job done. All this community policing stuff doesn't apply when lives are on the line." James's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice calm. Showing strength doesn't mean using force. It means controlling the situation without putting lives at risk. Carrington muttered something under his breath and returned to his position. But the exchange left James uneasy. He knew that if Carrington acted independently, it could unravel everything they were trying to accomplish. The standoff continued, the tension palpable as the sun began to set. Negotiations were progressing, though slowly. Hernandez's patience and skill seemed to be working, calming the suspect enough to buy more time. Suddenly, the suspect made a demand. He wanted to speak with the police chief. James didn't hesitate. He picked up the megaphone, his voice steady as he spoke. "This is Chief Williams. I'm here to listen. Let's talk." There was silence from within, but after a tense pause, the suspect's voice came over the bank's intercom system. "You're the chief. Huh? Are you going to let me leave? Or is this all a setup?" James could hear the fear and desperation in the man's voice, and he knew he had to keep him calm. "I'm here to make sure everyone leaves safely, including you. No tricks. Just talk to me." For a moment, it seemed to work. The suspect's voice softened, and James could hear him breathing heavily over the speaker. But then, a loud noise erupted from the back of the building, the sound of breaking glass. Carrington, unable to sit still, had tried to force an entry through a side window, hoping to take the suspect by surprise. The gunman's voice turned frantic. "I knew it. I knew you'd try something." Panic laced his tone, and James knew the situation had turned critical. "Stop! Everyone back!" James shouted to his officers, his voice unyielding. He grabbed the megaphone again, addressing the suspect. "That wasn't part of the plan. No one's coming in. I'm here to keep you safe. I give you my word." For a moment, there was silence, and then the suspect spoke, his voice trembling. "All right, I'll come out, but only if you're the one standing here. No tricks." James nodded, signaling for his officers to hold their positions. He walked forward, his hands raised, and positioned himself directly outside the bank's entrance. The door slowly creaked open, and the suspect stepped out, hands trembling as he surrendered. Officers moved in swiftly to detain him, but with care, following James's orders to avoid any unnecessary aggression. As the situation was brought under control, James let out a breath of relief. The hostages were unharmed, the suspect detained, and a potentially deadly confrontation had been averted. But his relief was quickly overshadowed by anger as he turned to find Carrington. James found Carrington standing off to the side, a scowl on his face as he watched the scene unfold. He didn't even try to hide his disdain as James approached. "Carrington," James said, his voice low and controlled. "What you did could have gotten those hostages killed. Do you understand that?" Carrington shrugged, his expression defiant. "Chief, I did what I thought was right. You're the one playing politics, trying to talk your way out of a situation that needed action." James's patience was gone. "Action? You nearly sabotaged everything we were working for. If you can't follow orders..." Carrington's eyes narrowed. "Maybe I don't want to follow orders that get good officers killed." James stepped closer, his voice cold. "I won't tolerate reckless behavior that puts lives at risk. Effective immediately. You're suspended. Go back to the station and turn in your badge." For a moment, Carrington looked like he was going to protest, but something in James's gaze stopped him. He turned on his heel, muttering under his breath as he stalked off, leaving James alone to face the aftermath of the crisis. Back at the station, the fallout from the hostage situation rippled through the ranks. Officers who had witnessed Carrington's defiance murmured among themselves, some expressing frustration at his actions, others quietly supporting him. The divide was palpable, a reminder of the old guard's lingering resentment. Lieutenant Smith approached James in his office later that night. "Chief, I just wanted to say, what you did out there today, keeping that suspect calm, keeping everyone safe, it was remarkable. You made the right call." James nodded, though he felt the weight of everything pressing down on him. "Thank you, Smith, but I worry. As long as officers like Carrington hold onto their old ways, we're going to be fighting battles from within." Smith sighed, his face sympathetic. "We can't change everyone, Chief, but today showed us something important. The ones who believe in your vision, the ones who want a department that values every life, they're standing with you." James looked up, meeting Smith's gaze. "Then we'll keep going. No matter how hard it gets, we're going to keep pushing forward." In the days that followed, James continued to address the department's divisions, holding meetings to reinforce the values they were building. He made it clear that officers who couldn't adapt to the new standards would face consequences, and he welcomed those who shared his vision to help lead the change. One evening, as James walked through the quiet station, he saw Officer Hernandez speaking to a group of recruits. Hernandez was recounting the hostage situation, emphasizing how de-escalation had saved lives. The recruits listened intently, their respect for the chief's leadership evident in their faces. James felt a sense of pride watching Hernandez. The younger officer had been hesitant about the changes at first, but he had stepped up, becoming a crucial supporter of James's mission. It was moments like these that reminded him why he had started this journey. As he walked back to his office, James paused by the empty spot where his father's motorcycle had once been parked. He smiled, a bittersweet feeling settling over him. His father's legacy, once symbolized by the motorcycle, had taken on a new form, a department that valued justice, integrity, and the dignity of every person they served. This was a legacy he was proud to leave behind, one that would carry forward long after he was gone.